one civil war to a war that's playing out in Gaza with very similar understandings, a horrific event that took place on October 7th, and the thousands that have died so far in the conflict in Gaza in 11 months. I know you recently did something on the violence that's happening in the West Bank. And a lot of people may not even know the difference between Gaza and the West Bank and what is happening there with Israeli settlers and Palestinians. So I would love for you, if you can, tell us a little bit about this piece that you did recently on the settler violence that's happening there for people that don't know the figures of the hundreds that have been killed so far in the violence that's happening in the West Bank. What is going on there that is kind of akin to what is happening in Gaza, or maybe it isn't? Can you explain a little bit for our audience and the piece that you recently did on that?
So just to lay the groundwork first, Gaza is just one of the areas within the Palestinian territories that Palestinians live in and that have been earmarked for a future Palestinian state in a two-state solution, something that's been going on now for decades as an idea. Gaza is where that war is happening right now. It's where the attacks came from on October 7th. It's where Hamas is in power. And that's where more than 40,000 people now have been killed in this war in the last nearly year. The West Bank is on the other side of Israel. It's another area, it's much larger. There has been a concerted effort by successive Israeli administrations to try and make Gazans and West Bank Palestinians think of themselves as separate. As more and more sanctions have been put on Gaza since 2005, since the Israelis pulled out, more and more sort of loopholes have been opened in the West Bank to allow business, to allow development there. But one of the key issues is this issue of settlements. Now, there are three areas inside the West Bank. Areas A and B are areas that only Palestinians can live in. There's this area C, which is governed by Israeli security control, but where Israelis are not supposed to live. And settlers are people who believe that all of the Palestinian territory, as well as Israel proper, should be Israel. And they go out and they build settlements. This has been happening for decades. It is illegal under international law for them to build on this land. But firstly, they go and do it anyway, and they're often protected by the IDF in doing so. And secondly, particularly since Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government came in nearly 2 years ago, this extreme right-wing government that he put together, they have received more and more support from extreme right-wing members of that government who want more and more settlements to be built. Now, there are already 700,000 settlers living in the West Bank, more now. I mean, there have been more pushes more in the last few months. There are 3 million Palestinians living there. And what these settlers do, some of them are, they may be doing something that is illegal under international law, but they are living peacefully there, and what they want to do is live peacefully there. But some of them, the extreme settlers, they take up weapons and they go and they harass Palestinian farmers. We're not talking about Palestinians who, which is a very small number, but may or may not be involved in any kind of militant activity. You know, those who are involved in that always live in the major towns and cities. We are talking about the most vulnerable of Palestinian people. They would never have touched a weapon in their lives. They couldn't have. They would have been shot or imprisoned immediately. We're talking about herders who earn pennies, who just depend on the land and have done so for generations. They are being assaulted. Their solar panels are being destroyed. Their water supplies are being cut off. Settlers turn up with weapons and threaten them, threaten their children, drive them off the land, and often kill them. We're seeing more and more killed and injured in the last few months. As the world has been focused on Gaza, settlers inside the West Bank have been setting fire to villages, setting fire to olive groves, which is the main form of livelihood for Palestinians there. And there's not really any focus on it because the world is watching Gaza. Now, that's what's happening with the settlers there. But secondarily, we also have an assault on the West Bank, which has become particularly acute in the last few weeks by the IDF. And that is where I'm talking about these towns and cities and camps in the West Bank, which are very densely populated. They're very different from the rural areas. It's been going on for decades, but it started almost immediately to ramp up after October 7th. But in the last few weeks, we've seen an unprecedented scale of killing, of the destruction of these towns, of camps. Jenin camp, for instance, there are reports from inside the camp that 70% of it has been bulldozed by the IDF in just the last few days. The camp is closed off. What the IDF does is they close off these camps and towns so that people can't leave, and they're trapped inside, and then they're assaulted. We've seen numerous children killed. nearly 600 now. And in fact, the number goes up every day, so it's probably risen. But at least 600 Palestinians have been killed by the IDF just inside the West Bank since October 7th. And more than 120 of those have been children, unarmed children, shot by soldiers. So there is a huge assault going on from multiple sides in the West Bank, and ignoring it means that we are going to have an even greater crisis about the lives of these Palestinians, about the future of this conflict once the war in Gaza does eventually end.
So I want to give the latest statistics according to Al Jazeera, like Leila was just mentioning there. At least over 676 are dead in the occupied West Bank, including 152 children. This is as of a couple of days ago, but like Leila mentioned, these numbers continue to rise. Over 40,000 or so are dead in the war in Gaza. At least 94,000 are injured. And now obviously in the attack on October 7th, over 1,100 dead in Israel and over at least 8,700 injured. So this conflict, again, we're going to get into the end in sight for all of this, but I did want to ask you again, because this is more of a personal front now, Leila, because obviously we follow each other on social media. We know each other now through these interview series that we've done. And you became the subject of ire amongst, Jewish friends of mine when I had you on the program. You and I kind of alluded to this about whenever there's a conflict between Israel and Palestine and something makes the news, everybody and their mother has an opinion about it. But what's happening in Venezuela, nobody has an opinion about it, right? From a national perspective, at least here in the US. And it's because of the Jewish diaspora and the Palestinian diaspora here in the States. And we're seeing it in college protests manifesting itself. So I say all that to say, what would you say to that person in terms of the way PBS is covering this and the war itself? Because you mentioned a couple of things there about Bibi's government. We're seeing protests that are happening right now as there were hostages killed in all of this. So clearly there's public sentiment around it, and you're trying to give coverage to it. What do you make of the way people interpret the way you're doing the coverage specifically of this conflict?
The first thing to say on the personal note that you mentioned is there is no way that you can do this job and engage with the kind of people who will go after you personally as a reporter and attack you. I wake up every day to attacks from both sides, from all sides, from people who don't like what they've seen and what they've heard. So you just have to keep doing your job. I am, as I cover this and as I cover everything, aggressively neutral. My priority is human beings. My job is to show what is happening to human beings and hold those in power to account under international law and under their obligations to people. That's my job. Other than that, there is nothing that holds me except for reporting that truth and holding it against those facts as they are self-evident. Now, in terms of which side you support, etc. Many people want you to, and one of the very sad things about this conflict, beyond the devastation that it's caused to human lives, is how many reporters actually have taken sides. And it's, kind of rare for there to be a conflict in which reporters do so heavily take sides, but unfortunately some have. And so people become used to that. They become used to listening to an echo chamber of the kind of reporters and the kind of news stations on whichever side they're on that supports their views and that tells them what they want to hear. We don't do that. I am, as I said, aggressively neutral. I operate completely in the center, and my priority is to give a voice to every human being who is being affected by this. I sat in the days, the weeks, the months after October 7th, and I sat with the devastated families whose family members were killed and kidnapped in this horrifying terrorist attack. I've sat with the people who are rising up against Benjamin Netanyahu's government, who were doing so last summer before October 7th, as I reported on very heavily, who want something different for their future, who believe that this government does not represent them as Jews, as Israelis, and is actually endangering their children further, that this war has not prioritized the safety of the hostages and bringing them home as the first priority. I equally have sat with people like settlers who want to tell me about why they believe so strongly in this. And of course, I have sat with many Palestinians whose lives are being devastated every day by the impact of this. And one of the important things here is to contextualize all of this with the decades of history that have come before it. The reality is that many people reporting on this conflict and many people talking about this conflict don't know that historical context, and everything has to be set within it because events don't happen within a vacuum. These attacks in the West Bank aren't happening within a vacuum. Settlers didn't suddenly jump up one day and decide to do this. In the same way, The reason that we have got to this situation where there is this extreme right-wing government in Israel doesn't exist in a vacuum. It didn't suddenly pop up one day. That is my job. My job is to speak to human beings, to air their voices, and to contextualize that within history, within international law, and within politics. And that's what I'll continue to do. If you go and look at a series of reporting, you will see continued nuance and an attempt to cover every single aspect of this conflict and every single voice in this conflict. But of course, anybody who is angry and frustrated and hurt, as so many people across the region, across the world, across the United States are, because this is so personal to so many people. If you're looking to be made angry, if you're looking to only hear the voices you want to hear, then of course you're going to be frustrated when you see a single report in isolation.
Very well said, and I couldn't add anything more to that. It's why we have journalists like you on the show. I want to get to somebody who is a network host here in the U.S. who said something similar and akin to the media coverage and outrage of all of this. This is a soundbite from Chris Cuomo, who's an anchor for News Nation here in the U.S. I want to play this and get some reaction on the other side. So take a listen to this.
This was the headline in a discussion about the hostages being murdered. Where does this poisonous pursuit of parity end? Look, I get opposing the violence, the degree of death caused by Israel's retaliation, the occupation, the settlements, the lack of aid and media access. To want people in Gaza to be free and safe and determine their own fate. I'm here for all of it and present those arguments on the regular. But none of those desires will be met with Hamas terrorists in control. And no state would do much differently than Israel is right now if they shared a border with an organization pledged to their destruction. What I do not get is people saying, who cares about 6 versus 40,000 Gazans? This relativism, again, is poison.
All right, so you hear the frustration in his voice. I want you to put a bow on kind of where this war plays out from here. There's so many moving pieces. I've had Pentagon correspondents tell us on this show that Bibi can take a deal and this could be ended tomorrow. We've heard from Mehdi Hassan and others out there, prominent anchors, Ayman Mohideen, who's a friend of mine, all say the Biden administration can do something here and this will be over tomorrow. We've heard the former president, Donald Trump, say this wouldn't have happened under him, a hypothetical that we can't confirm, but that this could be ended tomorrow. So everybody has this opinion about this conflict. And there's so many moving pieces and there's so much nuance to it. But where does this actually end? Now that we've seen so much violence, so many protests, Leila, for the people that are listening to this that are Jewish, that are Palestinian, that want a two-state solution, that want a future where we just have peace. We keep saying peace. We don't see evidence of peace. And it's because, like you mentioned, there's so many moving pieces that without the historical context, if you don't bring that into play, you're not having a true conversation about this. So where do we go from here? What do you make of Chris's comments? And where does this conflict ultimately end?
Let's be very clear, firstly, that there is no parity here. More than 40,000 people are dead in Gaza, the vast majority of them civilians. That's not what this is about. You don't compare life for life, and anyone who's trying to do that is trying to pick a side, is trying to make this not about the reality that this is hell for everyone on the ground in this conflict. Secondly, it's completely untrue that any other state would have done what Israel has done in this war, because they wouldn't have been allowed to. Under international law, the Palestinian territories are occupied by Israel, and it's the responsibility of the occupying power to protect the people within that territory. Now, there's nowhere else, there's no other power that would be allowed to kill 40,000 people over nearly a year, not only without being stopped, but with their Western allies who say they want peace continuing to send weapons. So just to be very clear, that's not the case at all. And Israel is in this very special pocket. And that's something that many Jewish protesters, many Israeli protesters are angry about themselves. They feel that the level that this war has reached is one that they would never have supported in the first place, and that they can't believe is being done in their name, because it's not bringing about any form of peace. Now, firstly, the voices that we're hearing on the streets have not been listened to. People like one of those 6, Hirsch Goldberg Pollen's mother, Rachel, who is an incredible woman, an incredible advocate. I spoke to Hirsch's friends and family. He very famously, incredibly sadly, was at the Nova Music Festival and hid with his friends in a shelter. I visited those shelters, and Hamas terrorists were throwing grenades into that shelter. These incredibly brave kids threw the grenades back out and tried to save their friends. Eventually they couldn't, and Hirsch's arm was blown off and he was then kidnapped. He managed to survive months underground with that horrific injury. He was a peace advocate, like so many of these kids, like so many of the people murdered and kidnapped from the kibbutzes along the Gaza border. And so many of those families, since that horrific terror attack, have been advocating for a peaceful solution, have been advocating for a ceasefire. What Rachel wanted, Hirsch's mother, she wanted a deal. She still wants a deal. These people feel that the government has taken away from them their right to say what they want, and is using them as an excuse to continue this war that's now become about territory, about security control, and not about saving their children or memorializing their children by finding a peaceful future in which children on both sides of this conflict will not be exposed to the same kind of violence. They're not being heard. Right now, what's clear is that Benjamin Netanyahu and his government are pushing forward with whatever they like. They have decided that they've gone so far in not listening to their allies and not listening to the international community and not pulling back, that this is now their opportunity to achieve whatever it is they want to achieve, whether that's strikes on Hezbollah, whether that's decimating Gaza, which is what they've already done. It will take at least a decade at the moment to rebuild Gaza. So there is something the Biden administration can do, and that is to stand up and say, we will not accept any more of this violence and this fighting, and a deal has to happen now. Enough of these small-minded disagreements, enough of negotiating over security control and whatever else. We need a ceasefire. We need this fighting to stop. We need the hostages to be released. We need Palestinian children and families to have some form of breather. These people are living in camps by the sea with no food. They're getting diseases like polio, which have been eradicated for decades. That's what has to happen now for any kind of peaceful future. This has to stop for everyone involved. And that's what those voices on the streets in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem right now are calling for. They want their hostages home. They want an end to this violence.
You can check out all of Leila's fantastic work over at pbs.org or type in newshour.org, type in Leila Molana-Allen. Leila, you do phenomenal work. I want you to continue to please stay safe, continue to do phenomenal reporting. You're welcome back on the program anytime.
Thanks so much, Mike.